Welcome to 35 West. I'm Ryan Berg, Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and host of the 35 West podcast.
Was how professional the Mexican government.
Are we ready? I don't think.
Reform trends in Argentina.
Right. And that's what happened.
Role at all in the NAFTA negotiations.
Welcome to 35 West. I'm Ryan Berg, Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and the co-host of the 35 West podcast. President Trump's return to the White House has brought a radical shift in U.S. Mexico ties, reshaping relations between the two neighbors. Within his first 100 days in office, the U.S. president declared a national emergency at the southern border, directed U.S. troops to help seal it, designated several Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, and threatened to impose tariffs on Mexican imports unless tougher action is taken to curb the flow of fentanyl and migrants. As an effort to defuse Trump's tariff threats and the prospect of kinetic action, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has launched high-level operations targeting drug cartels, including deploying 10,000 National Guard troops to the southern border, dismantling dozens of clandestine drug labs, and handing over 29 criminal leaders to the United States on February 22nd. In her first 100 days in office, Sheinbaum seized 2,000 times more drugs than AMLO did in his first 100 days, and in her first 6 months in office, Sheinbaum has detained more criminals than AMLO did in his entire 6-year term. While Sheinbaum has so far proven capable of navigating President Trump's hardline negotiation style, the road ahead for U.S. Mexico security cooperation remains uncertain. To help us understand how U.S. pressure on Mexico under President Trump is reshaping the U.S. Mexico security relationship, we are delighted to be joined today by Cecilia Farfán-Méndez, head of the North American Observatory at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. In this episode, we delve into the paradigm shift underway in U.S. Mexico security cooperation under Trump's policies, assess the effectiveness of the U.S. and Mexico's measures, and discuss the future of security cooperation between the two neighbors. Thank you for joining us today, Cecilia.
Thank you for having me.
The U.S.-Mexico security relationship is entering a new phase under recently elected leadership on both sides of the border. Cecilia, can you begin by sketching a scene setter for our listeners? In what way does the current situation of security cooperation, the dynamic under the Sheinbaum and Trump administrations, differ from that of her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, which coincided with President Trump's first term in office?
Thank you. So I think what we're seeing today is definitely more engagement of Mexico with the U.S. So there's been visits made by Mexico to Washington, D.C. President Sheinbaum has met with Homeland Security in Mexico City as well. So we're seeing this high-level engagement take place. And one of the things that has been interesting too is that there's a change in tone in two important areas. So while emphasizing that Mexico wants its sovereignty to be respected, President Sheinbaum has spoken on fentanyl, in particular saying that this is an issue where they don't want U.S. citizens or anyone really dying from fentanyl overdoses. And this is definitely a departure from the López Obrador days when he characterized fentanyl as a U.S. exclusive problem. And the other part of it is also the narrative around how they want continuous engagement with the U.S. So there's always a discussion around how it's important to maintain an open dialogue and open channels of communication with our neighbor and our partner. Again, something that we didn't really hear a lot during the López Obrador days.
President López Obrador's term was characterized by surging violence, the bloodiest 6-year term in Mexico's history, and often characterized by the phrase abrazos no balazos, or hugs, not bullets. The sense broadly, Cecilia, was that the Mexican federal government was uninterested in taking the fight to organized crime in favor of focusing on other issues, and certainly less willing to cooperate with the United States. Now, in her first months in office, President Sheinbaum appears to be moving away from this security strategy. In your opinion, how much of this can be attributed to domestic pressure? Her worst approval numbers still remain on security. And how much of it is the result of a U.S. administration laser-focused on criminal organizations, drug trafficking, and border security?
So let me add some nuance to part of your question, which I think it's important, especially in the context of U.S. Mexico. So I would argue that no one who really pays attention to security would defend the hugs, not bullets as a strategy. Like, I absolutely agree with that. I would say, however, that I think from the U.S. side, even in the previous administration, there was perhaps not enough attention being paid to the fact that López Obrador was also counting on this idea that the lack of economic opportunity is what leads to crime. And so in that regard, there were a lot of programs directed to providing economic opportunity with the idea that this would reduce crime. Of course, we can say this may not be the only reason why people join criminal groups, but I do think it's important to, again, take into account that there was at least some push in that direction. How effective it was, that's difficult for us to know because unfortunately the government has not made that information publicly available to really have an evaluation of those programs. But I think it's important to add that. Now, in terms of what's happening today with President Sheinbaum, I think there's definitely the pressure from the U.S. that helps us explain what is going on. But I would also argue that this responds to domestic pressure as well. So looking at the most recent victimization survey from Mexico, 60% of Mexicans in 2024 were expecting security to worsen in the next year. So of course, she came into office knowing that this is a top concern for Mexicans. And actually, the lack of public safety is the top concern, according to the victimization survey, for most Mexican citizens. Also around 60% answer that public safety is their top issue. So certainly something that she had to address domestically. Now, of course, with the health of the Mexican economy on the line, I think there was an understanding too that however things were being conducted under López Obrador could not continue on that path, and that, her administration had to offer a different answer to that. Is this the most productive way to engage with your neighbor and partner? Probably not. But I think, again, there's the two parts, certainly the pressure from the US, but also her own domestic agenda of addressing these issues.
Sheinbaum has focused her efforts on appeasing tensions with her U.S. counterpart. Nevertheless, she has not quite addressed Mexico's ongoing disappearance crisis, brought into the spotlight by the recent discovery of the ranch in Teotitlán, Jalisco, what the media has termed a recruitment or extermination camp. With her approval rating currently at about 75%, do you think her reluctance to confront the disappearance crisis could ultimately erode public support? Or like AMLO, do you think she will be able to weather low approval ratings on security policy?
I think it should be essential for her administration to pay attention to the disappearance crisis and arguably the forensic crisis that the country has. I definitely think there's an element here that if we look at how López Obrador ousted essentially the head of the National Search Commission, so this body that was created specifically to address disappearances in the country, her departure of Carla Quintana was not a good one. And she basically alluded to the fact that they were asking her to change the numbers so that disappearances would look lower, right? And so I think in that departure, what we saw was a lot of erosion of trust between the colectivos of these families who are searching for their missing ones and the relationship with the government, especially one that started out being very hopeful because you had someone like López Obrador in office with the idea that he would care about disappearances. So I think President Sheinbaum comes into a space where, again, that trust has been eroded considerably with the families. And so her administration has to rebuild that trust, which we know takes time and it's not easy to do. And so I think certainly there's a long way to go in rebuilding that trust that would also include identifying the, I believe, almost 72,000 bodies that the Mexican state has in custody that remain to be identified. And that is a question of how much the state wants to do it, but I would argue it's also a question of forensic capacity. Most of the time, medical examiners' offices don't have full-time personnel, meaning that people who work in these spaces work there maybe part-time because the state cannot afford to pay them longer. And so there is a question certainly of how much of this is willful negligence, but then there's another question of legitimate state capacity to respond to it. But certainly a tall order ahead for her. And again, one that I don't think, if she wants to have a long-lasting impact on security, one that she can ignore.
Cecilia, let's talk about the security strategy Sheinbaum released early in her administration. The strategy was formulated by the lauded security chief Omar Garcia Harfuch, who was Sheinbaum's security chief while mayor of Mexico City, and who oversaw notable improvements in public security. That strategy focused on focusing forces and intelligence on hotspots around the country. To what extent is that plan sufficient to tackle Mexico's public security crisis? And is this still the plan that Sheinbaum is pursuing, or is she pursuing a more improvised security strategy in the face of U.S. pressure?
I mean, I think what Omar Garcia Harfuch is doing is important in terms of thinking about investing more in intelligence by the Mexican state. And certainly he is, I would argue, a very readable character, if you will, or public servant in terms of what a public safety secretary should look like, right? And this is especially true for some of the people in the US who expect security to look a certain way. Now, I think what's happening is that this is taking place in a context where now Mexico, in about a month, is going to elect its entire judiciary system. And so, of course, any law enforcement effort has to be accompanied by a functioning criminal justice system. And because this massive overhaul essentially is taking place, this huge experiment that Mexico is going to have, again, in less than a month, I think it's challenging for whatever security strategy we have in place or Mexico has in place. How are they going to manage, again, how the criminal justice system will respond to that? And so this is taking place in a context of a lot of change. The other question is that even though Garcia Harfuch has become sort of the central character in discussions around public safety in Mexico, we should not forget that this also happened in the context of the armed forces having increased responsibilities, not only around public safety, but very much around building the Mayan train or helping to clean seaweed, or, I mean, you name it, right? If you need a haircut, they'll do that too. In some areas in Mexico, they'll offer free haircuts for the population. And so even though he's a civilian, the reality is that we still have heavy presence of armed forces around public safety. And again, this massive change in the judicial system that also impacts the criminal justice system. And so how much he can do, I think it will be contingent on these two. Now, is this part of her plan? I think so. I mean, this is someone who was with her when she was mayor of Mexico City. He was the chief of police. So I think there's definitely some plan there. Are there other actions that they're probably taking in the face of U.S. pressure? Arguably, yes, like the transfer of these prisoners that happened, that it wasn't quite an extradition. And so I'm sure there's some actions that are being taken that were not necessarily discussed beforehand, but certainly I think within the margins of what this administration is comfortable doing.
Talk to us, Cecilia, about how Mexican organized crime groups have reacted to these recent developments. Are there any signs that the cartels are adjusting their operations in response to the government pressure, as well as their FTO designation by the United States?
I think it's too early to know what adaptations they are making, but I think we can definitely say that there will be adaptations, right? Because any organization that plans to survive over time, whether illicit or illicit one, needs to adapt. So how are they going to do this? We still don't know, but I definitely expect criminal groups to adapt to this pressure that we're seeing, especially if they don't necessarily want to be transferred to the US or, having other measures against them. But I definitely think that we'll see some of these adaptations. Which ones, I think it's too early to tell.
The Trump administration has tied tariffs in Mexico to clamping down on cartels. Here is another dimension where Sheinbaum appears to be diverging from AMLO, who often elected for a more confrontational approach to security cooperation. Early in the Trump administration, Sheinbaum pushed for the establishment of working groups on select issues. One area that was quite important for Mexico was the flow of U.S. guns into the country, a perennial thorn in the side of the U.S. Mexico partnership. What steps has the United States taken to curb the demand and stem the flow of illegal firearms to Mexico, and what more could both countries do?
One of the things that we have seen is definitely this was a priority of the López Obrador administration, and it was very much front and center in the bilateral agenda. And I think now what we're seeing, after the first pause on tariffs happened in early February, President Sheinbaum in her tweet mentioned that firearms trafficking had been part of the conversation. So at least we have some sense that this is still part of the bilateral agenda. Now, I definitely think that if we want to talk about security in Mexico, firearms trafficking is part of that conversation. I mean, the most recent data from the ATF shows that, more than 2/3 of the arms that are recovered in Mexico and then are submitted for tracing were sourced in the US. And this is important because when you ask me, what else can both countries do? I think the finger pointing with fentanyl and firearms has not been very productive. I think a conversation around the fact that we have excess mortality in both countries and both people in Mexico and the US are very much dying what are preventable deaths, should be the departure point for then taking action and finding a common path for working together. And let me share with you, some data that I find particularly interesting. So, of course, Mexico for the last almost 20 years has been in the news constantly because of high levels of violence, in particular homicide. And the most recent homicide rate that we have is 24 per 100,000 people. This is way higher than the global average of around 6 per 100,000, and definitely higher than the Americas at its 15 per 100,000. Now, the overdose death rate in the US is higher than the homicide rate in Mexico. It's 25 per 100,000. And so I think that's the conversation that both countries should be having, especially because we know that the drug market and the firearm market are linked. And so if we want to, again, reduce these deaths, we should be having the conversation of this is a shared problem and how can we tackle it together. So I think that change in thinking would be the necessary departure point to then have effective policies to address these issues.
Cecilia, in its initial announcement of tariffs on Mexico, the White House cited, quote, an intolerable alliance, unquote, between the Mexican government and organized crime. What do you make of this allegation, and what can the Mexican government do to convince the U.S. administration that it is breaking that alliance or that it's doing enough on corruption and cartel penetration of public institutions?
I think that statement created a very difficult position for the Mexican government because essentially it is a blanket statement about the entire government, not necessarily specific areas of government. And so we know for decades, one of the issues that has been on the bilateral agenda is the question around corruption in Mexico and corruption in certain institutions. And so I think this broad statement about collusion is not very helpful because, again, it then forces the Mexican government into a position where how do you cooperate in the context of also wanting to show that you are protecting your sovereignty, something that we know the Mexican government, regardless of which administration is in office, cares a lot about. So I think one thing is that that type of public statement is not necessarily helpful when it comes from anyone, but in particular from the US. I think that conversation can take place, but not necessarily in that public manner. Now, I think so far what the Mexican government has done seems to be at least enough to manage that relationship. And again, underscoring that they do want to have an engagement with the US. So I think by doing that and by saying, again, that they do want to have that open channel for dialogue is important to show that precisely they're interested in cooperating. Now, in the meeting that Homeland Security had with President Sheinbaum in Mexico City, there's also some discussion around exchanging perhaps biometric information. We'll see if something comes of that and what terms. But I think, again, underscoring that they do want to collaborate is important to, show the US that there is a path forward and a space to work together on these issues.
Perhaps the greatest sign of a paradigm shift, Cecilia, in security cooperation is the consistent drone surveillance over Mexico, an intelligence gathering exercise that the Mexican defense minister has admitted is sending valuable intelligence for making interdictions. In response, Mexico announced its collaboration with the U.S. in conducting aerial surveillance, targeting cartels and organized crime. How would you characterize U.S. Mexico intelligence sharing at this stage? And what else can be done to strengthen cooperation in this area?
I would probably classify it as it's complicated or more in like a rebuilding stage. And I say this because last summer, when Ismael Zambada, better known as El Mayo, was arrested in the US, but taken to the US, according to him, against his will, the Mexican government was very public about the fact that that had been a unilateral action by the US government and they had not been done in collaboration with the Mexican government, which also, in a way, underscored the lack of trust between both governments to exchange any type of information on these. So I think now that there is this, again, public acknowledgement of these aerial surveillance, there's still some ways to go. I think, security tends to be the most challenging area of the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the US. And you have to trust the people that you work with. And I think, here, of course, there's a need to do it and you're going to engage because you have to, but in order to really see productive collaboration between the two, partners have to trust each other. And so I think, this could be some steps towards rebuilding that trust. But again, some of these blanket statements accusing the government of, just corruption, regardless of who it is, are not going to be super helpful towards that. So I would, yes, characterize it as we're not back in the days where things were working better than they were today, but I wouldn't say that this is the worst that we have seen. I think, again, we're in a rebuilding stage, hopefully, of trust between partners.
A few weeks ago, the media reported on conversations regarding drone strikes on Mexican cartels. In your opinion, how probable do you think this is to actually happen? And will authorizing drone strikes on drug labs be effective in reducing the supply of drugs flowing across the border? Could it possibly have a deterrent effect on criminal organizations?
So I think this is the one that probably keeps me up at night the most. And if you ask me, how likely is this to happen? I don't have an answer for that in terms of, I cannot give you a number of this is how likely it will happen. The thing that worries me the most is that we have seen this conversation move from the fringe towards the center, right? This is something that used to be discussed in very specific policy circles, and now we see it has moved towards the mainstream. Now, I think this would be disastrous on many levels. Certainly, this would truly erode any diplomatic collaboration between the two countries. Mexico would not necessarily have an appetite to collaborate on other issues like migration after this happened. But more importantly, it wouldn't achieve the outcome that is wanted. The idea that you can eliminate the drug trade by having drone strikes, I think fundamentally misunderstands how drug trafficking works. It has a series of middlemen and women. These are long supply chains that are located in Mexico and the US. And so this idea that you can just have a strike and that will have a meaningful effect, I think misses the point again on how the business works. And more importantly, we have heard this administration in the US being very concerned about how migration takes place in the US. And we know that violence displaces populations. And so this would essentially create the outcome that you don't want, meaning people potentially coming to the U.S. Mexico border in seek of asylum precisely because they have been displaced by violence. And so can this deter drug trafficking organizations? I don't think so. I think that as long as there's a demand, there will be actors willing to supply that. And a more effective approach would be thinking about how you disrupt a supply chain, and drone strikes are simply not going to disrupt a supply chain.
So far, Mexico has managed its relationship with the Trump administration handily, but there remains a risk of miscalculation that could endanger both countries' security. Cecilia, in addition to the unilateral U.S. military intervention that you just talked about, what do you view as some other key red lines from Mexico's side that could imperil further cooperation between the two countries?
I think the discussion, for instance, of designating fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction could potentially also create more distance between Mexico and the US. I don't see Mexico joining that type of designation or classification of fentanyl because it just simply does not align with how Mexico acts in multilateral spaces. And so that type of classification of fentanyl, for instance, I think would create, again, more distance between Mexico and the US on these issues. And I think, in addition to drone strikes, if we were to see something similar to what happened with Zambada, I don't necessarily think that would be well received. And again, considering that there is, you have a new government in Mexico, you have a new government in the US, there was an opportunity to talk about a reset between the two countries. And if we're in this rebuilding stage of sorts, having another operation like that, I'm sure would not go a long way in rebuilding that. So those would be two that concern me if we were to see them.
Cecilia, on the flip side of the coin, what opportunities might there be for both countries to take advantage of this moment to revisit their prior assumptions about bilateral security cooperation? Do you see any places where the U.S. Mexico partnership might, in fact, be strengthened?
I think one area for me that has not received enough attention, I would argue, in the last decade or so, is to have more subnational engagement, both from Mexico and the U.S. I think there's a lot that can be achieved at the subnational level. And certainly, I think if we were to, or if both countries were to think about how can they engage outside Washington, D.C. and Mexico City, there could be some movement there. And this is because violence in Mexico doesn't look the same in every state. And I'm sure there's areas in which both countries can find paths forward for that. So I think if the US were to think about how they can engage at the subnational level, that's an area that, in my opinion, has not been explored enough in recent years.
Cecilia, this podcast has covered a lot of ground, but is there something that we didn't cover? Anything else that you would like to highlight or add for our listeners?
I mean, I think I would like to perhaps point out two things that are, in my opinion, important for understanding the engagement that Mexico has with the US. And one is that a fundamental characteristic of the U.S. Mexico relationship is that it's a very asymmetric one. And so any framework that provides certainty for both partners is a good idea. So any instrument that allows them to be proactive rather than reactive when there's a security crisis, I think precisely because of this asymmetry, is something that helps them. And we have seen that work in the past, and I think that's something that's worth considering, and for different reasons for Mexico and the US, but nevertheless important to have. And the other one that I would add is that for Mexico, navigating some of these issues is always challenging because items of the bilateral agenda that are foreign policy for Mexico tend to be domestic issues in the US, like migration. And so navigating that space between an issue that's foreign policy for Mexico, but can be a domestic issue in the US is a tricky one, and something that Mexico always has to figure out how to do it without coming across as wanting to change anything internally in the US, because that's not the objective, but that's the reality of how the relationship looks like. So my 2 cents on further understanding why Mexico does certain things.
Cecilia Farfán-Méndez, head of the North American Observatory at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Thanks for joining us on 35 West. We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
For you, thank you for joining. Stay tuned for the next episode of 35 West.